Well, Sarah, thank you so much for this impressive presentation. It was really indeed very stirring. But you know, the kind of trend you see in the UK, I mean, it's a similar problem here in India too. But don't you think it has much to do with the immigration policies, even in the EU countries? It's specifically UK over the past 5 years has become extremely stringent, especially in the case of students. Like, but unlike there would be a lot of EU countries that have a very soft immigration policy. Take for example Sweden, Finland, Norway. Even students, you know, the visa expires, they stay months on end within the country and there's no deportation or whatever extent. So have you seen any variations within the EU countries vis-a-vis these problems?
There's a lot of variation. The UK maybe perhaps a little bit unique in terms of the types of centres there are, but I'd say each European country has its own kind of immigration politics, its own sort of notions of belonging and who belongs. I mean, when we were at European Society of Criminology conference, we had a colleague who was presenting on Norway, which has a detention centre for migrants. So these places exist in other countries. It's not just the UK, but they kind of look differently. And some European countries kind of uphold a different kind of, you know, they follow the EU directive, returns directive, which limits detention. I think France is like a maximum of like a month, and then other countries follow it up to maybe a maximum of 18 months. But then the UK is unique. If you've heard anything about Italy and Greece, like the conditions in detention centers there are so bad that some countries aren't allowed to send migrants back to those countries to apply for asylum because the conditions are so bad. So there's a lot of variation, and definitely the UK, the political atmosphere is one that immigrants, whoever they are, define are a problem that needs to be contained, and detention emerges as a way to help contain them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Short question.
Yeah, no, it's short comment. I think part of the problem in India is that the law itself does not distinguish between refugees and illegal immigrants. Like it's governed by the draconian legislation, Foreigners Act and Citizenship Act. And the way the refugee framework works is that it's through the UNHCR. So UNHCR can give some sort of certificate to the government of India, so by default acknowledges. That's how the refugee status works. And India is not signatory to the Convention on the Status of Refugees. I think there's a lot of legal reform itself needed.
I know that we met through, she actually came to Oxford for a thing we organized in March. Rinpoche Mehta, she's at the University of Surrey J that I can't pronounce, and I'm really embarrassed. But I can send it to you because she's actually done really interesting research with Bangladeshi women who are imprisoned in West Bengal and talk to them in the prisons and sort of how they understand borders, which really kind of interesting conceptual work around if they even saw their border crossings as illegal, but the women didn't, and then they're being detained for this act by which they didn't think they did anything wrong. Thank you.
Right. One quick question. How does the UK reconcile this indeterminate detention against its obligations under the European Human Rights Convention or the European Human Rights Law? And just want to understand that.
Yeah, immigration authorities have the duty to inform the detainee how long they will stay.
And sorry,
On this case.
has there been Supreme Court legislation on this, or Supreme Court rulings on this, or at the European Court has it been taken up? I can't imagine that it hasn't.
I mean, it emerges as an issue for sure. I think the UK opting out of many things that the European Union sets in terms of standards kind of helps it get out of things that the EU imposes on them, which would be the limits on detention, so they don't have to be told how long they're going to be detained. It's just they're there until they're either agreed to leave or they get some kind of stay. But I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know the case law, but there's a lot of, people have to take their cases to the European Court of Human Rights. because the UK won't follow the human rights code the way that other countries do.
I think the distinction between the administrative power and the
Yeah.
executive penal power at least formally allows them to do a lot more.
Yeah.
It seems like a sort of a similar kind of procedural injustice that we going for here with our detainees, our foreigners. They're neither here nor there. They don't know where to be. And the reason in our cases at least, frankly, everything could be sorted out if there was 10 minutes of attention. Honestly. Nothing, there's no big deal about anything. And as you said, those Bangladeshi women, the Bangladeshi, they come in as families. They're picked up for some odd thing, smuggling something, or smuggling cattle. They don't know they're smuggling cattle. They're just trading between two families, or they've come over on a festival. Then they're all separated. The children are separated from the mother is separated from the father. They don't know where they are. They don't know their languages. They don't know they can't speak the same language, even though they are in the same language group. It's just plain cruelty, nothing else. And you go one by one by one. What we're trying to do is to get to some systemic agreement so that we can change all that. But it just doesn't percolate down even to get the policy down. Anyway, thank you. I don't want to depress you.
I'm already there, it's okay.
Professor Rachel Conway. Adolescent, or another nice subject. Adolescent to parent violence and criminal justice response. There you go.
Very
Be prepared.
cheerful topic for you all. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm really glad that my colleagues have woken everyone up. I hope I can keep you awake for the next 20 minutes. I've decided to just speak a bit more conversationally about the project that we've had and tell you a bit about adolescent to parent violence in the UK and the research that we've been doing. So I'm not going to use PowerPoint. And I'd just also like to extend my thanks to everybody here at LLU Delhi for inviting us here for what's been a really excellent conference, I think. And I know I'm fighting both the rice and the fact that everybody's been concentrating for 2 days, so I'll get going. I'm going to be talking to you about the topic of violence from adolescents towards their parents. And you've had my more detailed paper about this in your conference pack of readings. And at the beginning of that paper, there's a web address for the Adolescent to Parent Violence APV site at the Centre for Criminology at Oxford. And please do visit that site if you'd like to find out more about the work that we're doing. So the topic of adolescent to parent violence, I think, is one that is quite important for criminologists to take on. And the theme of our conference here is thinking about when criminal justice goes wrong. And I think we've focused, and quite rightly in many places, on miscarriages of justice and when things go wrong in the way that offenders are treated. But criminal justice also goes very wrong when it doesn't meet the needs or serve the interests of groups of victims. And I think there's evidence from across the world that often victims of domestic violence are very poorly served by criminal justice institutions, and that's something that we see worldwide. Adolescent to parent violence is a very particular form of domestic violence, if you like. And there are lots of discussions, it's a relatively new field, and there are lots of discussions about how we come to define it and whether we define it as a form of domestic violence and so on. But it is, we might say in relation to when criminal justice goes most wrong in cases of domestic violence, so when they result in domestic homicide. And the category of child to parent homicide is one within domestic homicides that's growing in number in the UK. In the UK, the government holds domestic homicide reviews every time somebody's murdered in the domestic context. And any family relationship in the close family context, they conduct a big review to see really what went wrong. So they look at previous attempts by the victim to seek help, but they also look at their medical records. They talk to their families. They collected lots of information to try to tell the story of what happened and how this ended up in a domestic homicide. Now, a number of those, the number of those that are child to parent, not necessarily from a young child, I mean a teenage child, some of them are teenagers, but the relationship being child to parent is growing, and there's a need to know more about that. So I think there we can see a very good example of criminal justice having gone very wrong indeed, not having met the needs of victims who in many cases, though not all, it must be said, has been repeatedly trying to get help and get into a safe situation. Okay, so our study and how it came about, it's not specifically about homicide, it's about violence from adolescents towards their parents and how that's processed and dealt with, particularly in the criminal justice system. So we took the social age range of adolescents from 13 to 19, the teenage years, and we looked at, through a number of different routes, what was happening with these cases. Now, I came across this topic kind of incidentally. I was doing some research in the youth justice system, and as part of that, I was interviewing some parents of young offenders, and some of those parents told me stories about experiencing violence from their adolescent children. And I thought this was quite interesting, particularly as in the UK, as in many jurisdictions, there had been quite strong drives to make parents legally accountable for the behaviour of their teenagers. So these parents are in a real double bind. If on the one hand they're being taken to court for the behaviour of their children, but on the other hand they're also experiencing violence and being the primary victim of their own child. So I went off to see what I could find out about this, and I discovered that in the UK this was a problem, that practitioners working in domestic violence projects, in youth justice, social work and so on, all recognised it as something that they dealt with on a regular basis. But there were no official records of it anywhere. Nobody had ever collected, nobody had ever looked within the police recorded statistics to see whether there were cases. Nobody had ever recorded it as a separate problem within youth justice or anywhere else. And at the time, around about 5 years ago now, there was no academic research. There's a small growing body now of academic research, but there was no academic research in the UK. There was some in the US and Canada and Australia. But it wasn't really usually within criminology, a couple of small exceptions, but it was mostly within kind of family studies type work, the more therapeutic work. Nobody had looked at what's happening when the police get called out to these cases. Now, it sits in an interesting place, I think, for us as criminologists, because on the one hand, it's something that has to have a clearly defined criminal justice response. We need to know that if a mother at home is being, and it's not always a mother, but if a mother at home is being beaten up by a child, that they can get the help of the police. We know that this comes up in the youth justice system regularly for young people that might be in the youth justice system for other reasons, but this is something that comes up regularly. And we need a clearly defined response to it. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we're talking about young people here, and we have a ridiculously low age of criminal responsibility in the UK of 10 years old. And so thinking about the processes of criminalising a child as something that might better be served by another kind of intervention is something that has to be held in balance with the need for a criminal justice understanding of it. Now that isn't to say it should be removed and left within the health service. What we've often seen, the kind of lived experience of parents in this situation, is that it can be, it can be quite extreme. You can be talking about a range of behaviour. What's it like to be a parent living in this situation? Well, you can be talking about a wide range of behaviour. We're often looking at violence happening over a prolonged period of time, a kind of continuum of behaviour which might be mixed up with lots of other ways that the child is coming to try to take power and hold power over the parents. So it might be that the child is being controlling in other ways, that they're really dominating the family home. The violence can range from pushing or slapping to actually much more serious violence. There are cases in ours where people have had, a woman's had a knife held to her neck, somebody's been pushed downstairs and so on. So there can be, bruises and broken bones and serious injuries, as well as the lower level of prolonged violence. But you end up with parents who may be very, very worn out, very worn down by constantly managing this behaviour, living in fear of their own child, and much in the way that victims of intimate partner violence often do, really tailoring their own behaviour, everything they do every day, from the moment they get up to the moment they go to bed, to try to see off the possibility of violence, just thinking all the time, being on high alert, high stress all the time, thinking about this kind of possibility of violence. Of course, we're also talking about problems for younger siblings living in the family. There may be problems for other relatives. There may be vulnerable older relatives in the family as well. But we're focusing here primarily on the teenager and child relationship. So it's been an interesting development doing this research at a time where, and our study has contributed something to this, but at a time where the problem is beginning to emerge onto the public agenda in the UK. So when I began the research, there was absolutely nothing. It was what we called a complete policy silence. It didn't appear in any policy for the police, it didn't appear in any policy from the Home Office, from the government or anything. And we're at the stage now where I'm leading, so the study was, perhaps it's better to contextualise time-wise actually, the study was a 3-year study funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, which is the government funding council for social research. And I led this study for 3 years. In the last year we've been writing a book from this study, which will be coming out next year. But I'm now running a small project which is working with the Home Office and the Youth Justice Board, some domestic violence organisations and some other agencies to produce the first kind of policy information guide for people working in the field about adolescent and parent violence. And the Home Office in the UK has put, they have what they call their action plan for violence against women and girls. That's the way that the government understands it at the moment. It's not only against women and girls, but that's where their focus is. And this government written action plan is publicly available. It's just been updated in March, and it has long details about all of the things that they're going to do in order to address this problem. So a big, broader problem of violence against women and girls. And into that, they've just inserted to provide information for practitioners about adolescent to parent violence. So it's the first kind of official recognition of this problem. So we're at this stage with it now where it's beginning to be officially recognised. But the fact that it was such a hidden problem is, I think, something very interesting. And there are interesting questions which are beyond the scope of what I'm talking about today, but about how something can continue to be recognised in the public domain all the time by practitioners who are working in the field in their everyday practice, and yet not make it into policy. I think it provides a kind of quite interesting example for us to think about how it is that certain problems come to be addressed and other problems don't come to be addressed, and what the reasons are for that is quite sociologically interesting. So I want to just focus for the purposes. Our study included, I think altogether about 120 interviews. We interviewed long, in-depth interviews with parents, with young people, with police, youth justice, domestic violence workers, and we did field work in youth justice and domestic violence, and also in projects that have been specifically designed around this, of which there are a handful in the UK. So we have this enormous amount of data, which we're in this process at the moment of turning into a book, a big and unwieldy process. But what I wanted to focus very specifically on here, for the purposes of the theme of our conference, was the criminal justice response to the problem. I think if victims of violent crime are not having their needs met, and this is one such example, I think, then we might really think about it being a case of criminal justice going wrong. So policing policy on domestic violence in the UK has developed quite considerably in many ways in recent decades, and there's more information on this in the paper, but there have been a number of different measures to try to address better the needs of domestic violence victims. Now, that's mostly being focused on intimate partner violence, and our official definition of domestic violence in the UK used to specify, until March last year, it used to say that both the victim and the perpetrator had to be over the age of 18. So it wasn't intended to apply to child victims who would come under child protection measures instead, or child perpetrators who are under 18. That's been lowered just over a year ago to 16. So now 16 and above is included. But fitting adolescent to parent violence with police domestic violence policy has been tricky for a number of reasons, and perhaps I'll just mention a couple of those. First of all, this issue of culpability and thinking clearly about the young person's age and the degree to which we can hold a young person culpable, fully culpable for violence within the home, and how that differs to how we might want to hold an adult perpetrator of violence within the home culpable. And you can think for yourself, I'm sure, about a lot of the difficulties around that. And there are obviously differences if we're talking about a 17-year-old to if we're talking about a 10-year-old, for example. But there are real issues to be addressed there around kind of blame and responsibility. Often, though not always, these families are families where there may have been a previous history of domestic violence. The child themselves might have experienced abuse, or there may be other factors. The child might have learning difficulties, mental health problems, substance abuse problems. There may be other difficulties within the family. Now, that's not always the case, and we did research a number of families where they brought up other children with no problems whatsoever and just had this one child that had really particular violent difficulties. So I'd be careful about not characterising these as all families that have had these troubles in these past histories. But the ones that have, it makes it difficult for us to think about at what point a child becomes fully culpable. Where are the boundaries of blame and responsibility, especially with our age of criminal responsibility of 10? And where might they be more blurred if the child themselves has experienced violence and at 12 they're lashing out and being violent? We might treat that quite differently in a different situation. So there's these issues about blame and responsibility, and there are also very key characteristics about this being a parent-child relationship. It's different, of course, to an intimate partnership, a husband and wife, for example. Violence between adults in intimate partner violence, usually male or female, is characterised very differently. In the UK, our treatment programmes are structured around the man, and it's usually men, so I'll use the genders, but the man being made fully responsible for his actions, that he doesn't excuse them, he doesn't give excuses to say, you know, my wife made me angry, or, you know, I was drinking these. He has to take full responsibility for his actions, and that the woman is encouraged to see herself as a victim, in danger, at risk, who ought to think very seriously about leaving that relationship. When we respond to violence between children and parents, we're looking, or from children to parents, we're looking at a very different situation. The likelihood is that that family is going to want to stay together, and it may be that there is a complete breakdown and the child goes into local authority care, but in many cases we might be dealing with a criminal justice response to an assault by a child, which will be followed up by the family being reunited and living together. Another practical difficulty is often they're reunited immediately, so where an adult offender might be arrested and held in police cells for a day or two, and measures might be looked for as some kind of injunction or something like that. These measures are just not available, and we've seen many cases where a young person's released at 3 o'clock in the morning, absolutely furious from the police cell, and sent straight back home to his mum. The other issue, of course, is thinking about what measures should be used and what might be the most appropriate measures. And I think the police have to work very hard to think about how they combine with other services in this situation and how they try to negotiate what the best responses might be. But there are still some very important similarities between adult domestic violence and intimate partner violence and child-to-parent violence or adolescent-to-parent violence. And some that came through very strongly for us in the study, just to go through this very quickly, are things like patterns of coercive control from a young person towards their parent, the young person developing very controlling behaviour, which might be something that seems almost symbolic, having control of the remote control of the television at all times, or having taken over a lot of the physical space of the house, the kitchen and the living room and other areas of a young person's domain, and a parent is left with just the bedroom that she's keeping herself within now, or checking on the financial situation of the parent, asking where they're going, who they're seeing all the time, isolating the parent, causing more trouble if they bring friends around. These are similar patterns, though the way that the control is expressed is within more bounds for an adolescent child than it is for an adult, I would say. And also these, as I say, these patterns of isolation and parents living in fear. So ultimately, and we've got a lot of data about how police struggle with responding to this, but ultimately it is a police matter. The violence can be serious, and the police will be the frontline responders who are called out to deal with this. And they were very used, when we went to do our research, they were very used to dealing with it. And in fact, we looked at police statistics in the Greater London area, so in the City of London, a much smaller city than Delhi. What's the population of London? 8 million, okay. So the City of London, our biggest city in the UK, has 8 million people, so very different to Delhi. But within that city, in a 1-year period, we found almost 2,000 cases that had been reported to the police and defined as offences by the police and recorded as such. So these weren't just the ones where the police were pulled out and told off the person and left. And the comparable number for the big category of domestic violence that includes lots of different relationships, husband and wife, but also other relationships too, a great big category, was 55,000. So the almost 2,000 was a significant enough number if you think about the difficulty of calling the police to your own child, especially in the context where you're being made responsible for their behaviour. There are particular challenges for the police in dealing with this. They have to struggle with thinking about what it is that parents want. Now, there's a huge amount of research around problems in the police in trying to prosecute intimate partner violence cases where the victim changes her mind, even if she's called the police, and decides that that's not the path she wants to take. And there are all sorts of measures in place, varying variations in how to respond to this. But it is an issue of what to do, and often that's the case, that parents who might be initially desperate and need some help understandably back off the idea of proceeding and wanting to criminalise their own child. But it may be the case that that is the right route to take in some cases. Working with other services is a challenge for the police. We've had a huge attraction of public services and cuts, particularly, for example, in parenting and family support services in the UK, which then leads to a difficulty in looking at who the police might refer on to, what they might do with these cases when they find them. And the issues that I've talked about around the age of the perpetrator, in inverted commas. There are in the UK some really exciting initiatives, small projects that have sprung up in areas due to the demand and the need, but there's only a handful of these unfortunately at the moment, but projects that specifically work to address adolescent parent violence, and they're doing some really great work, and I think they're going to be growing. And when we launch our information documents in the next few months, this policy guide that we produced with the Home Office, it's going to be launched to the children's services and police commissioners and people within the different areas in the UK, and they're going to be asked, what are you doing, to address this problem? So I think these programs are going to grow as the problem is becoming more publicly recognised. But there's a great example of one called the Step Up program in the US, in Seattle, that's been running now for 17, 18 years, very established. That's an interesting example of what could be. So I think just to finish up, I would be really interested to know, I'm not sure if we'll have time in this session, but if not, informally for me as well, whether anybody has any experience of this problem within India, and I suspect that you don't have any official data on it. It may be that nobody's looked to see whether police have been called out to cases like this. It would be interesting to know whether there is data on child-to-parent homicide, and whether anyone's looked back to see whether those cases had earlier versions of. I've visited and spoken about this work in countries all over the world, and everywhere I find that practitioners and domestic violence workers everywhere I've visited so far have direct experience of this problem, but in the official realm, much like our situation in the UK a few years ago, in the official realm there's no kind of labelling, recognition, data collecting about this, so it's something that isn't really much known about. So I think culturally there are bound to be enormous differences. There are huge differences in how families work within different cultures and how families are understood, and the ways in which families maybe soak up their own problems before immediately calling services and so on. But I wonder in the more extreme cases whether they might be known to services, and it would be interesting if anyone has had any experience of that. So I think I'll stop there and allow a bit of time for questions. Thank you very much.
Once again, Rachel, thank you so much for keeping to time. We do have 10 minutes before this session is up. And again, like Professor Pandey, I have to say that it is something that we've known about, something that we recognize does happen all the time in families, especially especially families that have to live very close together in small spaces, etc. But it's kind of not documented or understood in the kind of detail that you've tried to create. And it's great that you've got already some, study and then policy level changes and a recognition for this. I mean, I really envy you for the short time span within which you've got to the policy change. But please, anybody?
Michelle, I think this is actually a problem where you don't have this problem in a big way in Indian society because family is still considered to be the last best thing that supports the child even if he has gone out of hand. And it is the primary responsibility of the family to control the younger child. In societies in the Western world, where family system has changed or broken down, this has appeared as a very, very challenging problem. Now you seem to be equating domestic violence, adult violence, husband's violence, with child's violence. That is a little, I would say that UK has signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990, 2 years before us. And Convention on the Rights of the Child says, Article 1 says, any person below the age of 18 is a child. Here you would like to keep 13 to 19. Here you would like to keep 16 to 19. Adolescents. If it was beyond 18, then that was a different question. But you want, for your research purposes, this is an issue which I seem to be saying somewhere, conflict between gender, mother, and tender, that is child. Oncoming conflict between gender and tender. I am not saying that gender or mother's perspective as victim should be totally ignored. But I am only saying that you cannot totally squeeze the tender perspective also. So much so that youth justice is totally distorted, and your convention, you reduce the age in effect of child, make a 13-year-old also accountable, and equally accountable as an adult husband who has perpetrated violence against the mother, the woman. Now, that is the real problem. That's the problem. You enter into a policy level or of discussion. It's all right, you do research, but the consequence of this research is that I'm saying if there could be other means of protecting the victim interest, say out-of-bound orders could be issued for such child. He would not be permitted to enter the house. He would stay only in a boarding house. That kind of order. But I would say criminalizing the child, creating liability, accountability, blameworthiness under criminal justice system would be going a little too far, because it will then eat away the whole youth justice and the spirit of Convention on the Rights of the Child that has been ratified by the UK. And I remember 2003 House of Lords decision, where the House of Lords clearly said that where you ratify convention, there are implications, and you cannot take children in the criminal justice system that you took before ratification of the convention. There are implications. And how are you going to address those implications? How is UK going to address those implications? That will be very important for us, because we are in the throes of this kind of shift also. You are our leaders, and we would like to get educated by you, because UK, USA are our leaders of juvenile justice. So how are you going to resolve this? Sign the convention and at the same time reduce the age to 13. That will be real. I'm not saying victims' interest is not important. Could it be addressed apart from criminal liability, apart from the blameworthiness, accountability that is there?
Yes, is the short answer to that. It certainly could. And maybe some points of clarification. It's one of the difficulties of trying to explain a whole project in 20 minutes. But I'm absolutely not saying that we ought to make young people as accountable as adult offenders for violence. I'm definitely not saying that. And the tension and difficulty that you talk about is one that I think we're really trying to weigh up and struggle with in the study as our practitioners in the field, judges who are dealing with young people in courts and so on and so forth. It's something that has to be explicitly brought out and discussed. And as criminologists, as you rightly raise, we're long concerned about the over-criminalisation of young people. About the over-imprisonment of young people, about our very low, as I called it, ridiculously low age of criminal responsibility. How we respond to young people and what we do is right at the forefront of our work. And yet, on the other hand, we're not doing those young people any favours if we don't recognise the problem of adolescent-to-parent violence. I mean, these might be young people who are violent towards parents. Where are they likely to be when they reach the age of 20, 21? If people have just said that's a problem we don't need to deal with, young people can't be violent perpetrators. So it's an incredibly tricky balance, I think, and one that has to be dealt with in a very upfront way. There isn't an immediately straightforward answer to it. I would say that we should use, with all young people under the age of 18, I mean, I'm in favour of diversion measures generally from criminal justice, but with all young people under the age of 18, we should be using as many diversion measures as possible, and always the criminalisation part should be the last resort. That would be the first thing I would say. There may be some times when it's necessary. If the violence is particularly severe and the young person's not responding to any of the diversion measures and the parent needs protection, there may be times when those might need to be used. But equally, even if we're saying the criminal justice response should be the last response, it's arising all the time in youth justice work, and police officers are responding all the time and turning up at people's houses to respond to these cases. So we need a criminal justice response, even if that response is diversion wherever possible. So in terms of liability, I think I probably glossed over this very quickly, but the 13 to 19-year-old age group was what we took for our study because we wanted to understand the process of adolescence, the social age of adolescence across time. How did this vary from when somebody became a teenager to when they grew out of their teens? We could have taken, and we talked a long time about this, the youth justice age, but we wanted to understand the phenomenon and the experience that parents had with it across the social age of adolescence. So I'm not suggesting any new age of culpability of 13 to 19. It was just the bounds within which we collected data in our study.
In effect, you are not suggesting you are keeping the age of 18, but then in effect, if you take action against them, and they are subjected to, like adults, taking action means, unless you have totally different range of action. Diversion is all right, I understand, which is that is a real problem and challenge. And
it's absolutely,
and
we don't
this
have
challenge, the brain science, American brain science studies have added more confusion. Post 2002, they have studied and they have said that the brain develops at different phases. And a 16-year-old who is perpetrating violence, what do you do when a dog bites a lady of the house? Do you suggest imposing criminal liability on the dog? I don't think that you do. Because the child, if he is incapable of knowing the consequences, that is, taking a decision for that he should not do it,
We're not suggesting, I really do want to make that clear, that there should be any increased level of criminalisation or culpability. It has to be dealt with in a very sensitive way. It's absolutely crucial. In fact, one of the discussions that we're involved in at the moment, in the UK, we don't have an offence category of domestic violence that would be charged under other physical violence charges. And there's talk of creating one. And the reason why they want to create an offence category, there's a big consultation that the Home Office are doing about it at the moment. And the reason why they want to create one is because of the difficulty of capturing, from adult offenders they're thinking of particularly, but controlling patterns of behaviour across time. So domestic violence might not just would pick up a pattern of behaviour rather than just somebody happening, like one incident of hitting or something. But we're really struggling with this notion because if young people were charged with and received a conviction for domestic violence as teenagers, that's particularly problematic. And we think one of the things that we're feeding back is that there's a real need to understand the full realm of behaviour that could constitute domestic violence before thinking about whether it should be a criminal category. So a criminal offence category. So you're absolutely right. I'd just like to come back on one other point, which is the point about whether or not it happens here with the strength of family and family tradition that we have here. And one of the interesting things about that, it may well be the case that the strength of family and family ties means that this happens less than in other countries. It may be that there are particular characteristics in particular countries that make this much more likely to happen. But one of the interesting things I think that we found is where families, this is in the UK context of course, where all of our research has been, but where family ties are very strong and where there's a strong sense of family members taking responsibility for each other and parents being very responsible for their children and strong feelings of shame if any family member steps out of line because those ties and those binds are much stronger. In those situations where violence from a teenager to a parent happens, it can be harder and incredibly hard to speak out about it and to seek help. There's a kind of double bind in that situation, feeling like you have to keep your family loyalty and not allow that shameful story about what's going on in the family to come out. So we've had some examples of people from families from different cultures in our study who talked very powerfully about that feeling and that experience of needing to protect the family above all else until the point where they couldn't anymore and had to seek help. So it would be interesting to know, and perhaps in the future we might find out. I mean, one of the things it would be interesting to know is whether the police are ever called to incidents of this, and I imagine that there must be cases where they are. But we don't know that because, like the UK until recently and many other countries, there isn't any data collected on this at the moment.
Thank you. I really have to pick up on your we don't know, we just don't know, and we tend to stick to our notions that because we have a certain kind of family, that this certain kind of family is benign and always unrepressive and somehow noble in its silence. It's more like America.
I'm not sure whether I got what Mr. Kambal said in terms of whether it happens not in the family. I'm sure it does. But I think go back to trying to report that in police station, because we currently that would be within the criminal law, and in a regular domestic violence, like regular domestic violence cases, you are sent back within the same resolve this using media, settle the matter between yourselves, and so I'm not sure how we don't have anything to indicate what happens if, say, a woman goes to a police station, say, my 14-year-old is physically abusing. But we do have in our domestic violence legislation, if you look at the definition of a shared household or an agreed person under a domestic violence act, it would cover violence by a child on the parent, but respondent is defined as someone who's over 18 years of age. So it does not cover anyone under 18, but you already have that mechanism which is not criminal in nature, where if you remove the 18 years, it would cover any sort of adolescent.
If you remove 18 years, then POCSO also, they have the case will go to juvenile justice board.
No, no, I'm not saying
Juvenile
this.
justice, no, no.
When it's not criminal, it does not go to the juvenile justice court. It's what I'm saying is not protection of women against domestic violence act is a civil legislation. It's only when you violate the magistrate's order does it become criminal. So you already have that regime. You don't really need to do anything new except change the definition of respondent from 18 to whatever age.
But in terms of research, it's a
We
good
don't-
area to look at. And how many of these domestic violence cases do emanate from a child or so-called child whacking its parent? And especially older people. I mean, may not whack its parent, but certainly could whack its grandmother. And they all live together.
You see, in the UK, there's a better understanding of elder abuse, and the reason is that if you have a much older victim, constructing that victim as a vulnerable victim, what a victim ought to be, is considered more understandable. So it's where you have teenage children with parents that aren't yet elderly that it becomes a really difficult. People find it very difficult to think of a parent being a victim of their own child, but elder abuse is better understood. Our age has only just changed in the UK down to 60. It doesn't make any difference because it's not a legal category. It doesn't make any difference in terms of the offence being pursued because there's not an offence of domestic violence. But it was interesting even in the UK that change in age was made because of a concern about intimate partner violence between adolescents. So because you can actually marry at 16 in the UK and you might well live with somebody otherwise, and you could be married at 16, have a baby, but up until this change in the age, you couldn't be a victim of domestic violence until you reached the age of 18. So there was this a big concern that grew about the problem of domestic violence growing in the teenage years and what to do about that, how to properly address that. That's where the change in age came from. And it incidentally then starts to include these cases of adolescents who are violent towards their parents who weren't as advanced enough in the topic to have that drive for the age change. So, and that's a very recent thing, so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out and whether that makes a big difference. But it's interesting that your definition is already broad for domestic violence, so it could encompass cases from a number of different relationships within a shared household.
That's what it has to be.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. Just underscoring the points made, and of course I know that the British Asian context is very different, but from looking at families in the UK, I think this is an issue amongst Asian and Indian cultures, but it's just not spoken about, I think, and I think it's worth really remembering that although family structures are replicated, that they're very easy to be idealised, these kinds of things do go on. I think they're just harder to admit, and that it's perhaps worth taking a wider notion of violence as well. Sometimes we've got second generation children growing up in the UK, their parents don't speak English, and they're completely controlling the financial situation, and there are emotional pressures placed on parents, and so it's worth really kind of remembering that to think about it in different contexts, just because it's not obvious that it doesn't exist. So it'd be interesting to see your numbers, to look at the kind of breakdown, ethnic breakdowns.
Yeah, unfortunately the numbers are only in relation to police statistics that were recorded as crimes, and there's slight overrepresentation in the different ethnic categories, but it's in London, which is much more ethnically diverse, the police statistics that we have, but we need more data to really understand. I mean, one of the classic situations that we found, well, one of the very sad ones actually, was where a woman had actually escaped domestic violence, but her children had grown up with it when they were very young. Now, this isn't the only explanation. It's really important to say there are multiple pathways to this problem, but that's one of the circumstances. And then an adolescent, often son, as he grows up, begins to develop that behaviour and has already seen his mother be a victim of domestic violence, and she finds herself back in that situation, but with her own son. But also in families where there might be fairly, what we might think of as quite strong patriarchal or gender patterns in the roles within the family. If the father in the family is absent for any reason, the son might often stand up to that role, but that might then encompass using violence as part of how power is exercised. So I think there's some really complex patterns to get hold of.
Anu? Kiria? Good? Are we good? Okay, it's what time is it? My goodness, it's 11 minutes past 4, so I'm over time. Thank you very much for all of the presentations. They're really, really too much to absorb almost, because they're so rich and give us so much to think about. One of the things I'm certainly going to think about is I have a 2-month-old grandchild who I'm now going to approach with great caution.